Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going to step quietly into the Middle Ages and into a wedding that may feel more familiar than you expect. Picture a small stone church. It is early morning. The air is cool and still. Candles flicker along the walls. The smell of melted wax and damp stone floats gently in the air. Outside, a few villagers wait, speaking in low voices. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings once, then again. Inside, two people stand close together. Their hands are slightly nervous. Their families are watching. And in a few moments, they will promise each other something very serious. Marriage. Now here is the interesting part. Even if your wedding happens in a modern hall, on a beach, or in a garden with fairy lights and soft music, much of what happens during that ceremony would feel strangely familiar to the people standing in this medieval church. Because many of our wedding traditions did not begin recently. They began here. Let's start with the ring. The simple circle of metal. Today, we barely question it. Of course there is a ring. Of course it goes on the fourth finger. Of course it is round. But in the Middle Ages, the wedding ring became something powerful. It was not just decoration. It was a visible promise, public contract, a symbol everyone in the village could see. The circle shape mattered. It had no beginning and no end. It represented eternity, endless loyalty, endless unity. In a world that often felt uncertain, that idea brought comfort. And then there is the famous fourth finger. Medieval people believed that a special vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. They called it the vena amoris, the vein of love. Was it scientifically correct? Not exactly, but it was poetic. And poetry was more important than anatomy at a wedding. So when someone placed a ring on that finger, it symbolized a direct connection to the heart. It made the moment feel deeper, almost magical. And honestly, even today, that idea still feels nice. Now imagine the bride. Today, many brides wear white. Feels timeless, elegant, traditional. But in medieval times, brides did not always wear white. In fact, most brides simply wore their best dress. Fabric was expensive. Clothes were valuable. You did not buy a gown just to wear once and hide in a closet forever. That would seem very strange to a medieval family. Blue was a common color for brides. It symbolized purity and devotion. Red could represent joy and wealth. Green sometimes symbolized fertility. The idea of a white dress slowly became linked to purity and virtue through religious influence and cultural change. The church encouraged modesty and symbolic clothing. Over time, lighter colors became associated with sacred ceremonies. So while the bright white wedding dress became popular much later, the connection between marriage and visual purity has deep medieval roots. Now let's talk about something that may surprise you. Bridesmaids. Today they match for style, for photos, for aesthetic balance on social media. But in the Middle Ages, the reason was much more serious. People believed in spirits, in curses, in jealous forces that might try to harm a joyful event. A bride was seen as spiritually vulnerable. She was leaving one life and entering another. That transition felt delicate. So bridesmaids would dress similarly to the bride. Not more beautiful, just similar enough. The goal? To confuse evil spirits. If a dark force showed up hoping to cause trouble, it would not know who the real bride was. It sounds dramatic, but in a world filled with superstition and deep belief in the unseen, it made sense. In a strange way, modern coordinated dresses are a soft echo of medieval spiritual camouflage. Now think about the timing of weddings. Why were so many medieval weddings held in late spring or early summer? Part of the answer is religious. The church calendar guided life. Certain seasons were more appropriate for celebration. Some periods were meant for fasting or reflection, not grand ceremonies. But there was also a very practical reason. Bathing. Despite popular jokes, medieval people did bathe. There were bathhouses. There were washing routines. But daily hot showers were not common. especially in colder months. Warmer weather made bathing easier. Water was more accessible. Travel was simpler. Guests could gather more comfortably. So late spring meant cleaner guests, better roads, and fewer weather problems. Romance is important, but comfort matters too. Now imagine the ceremony ending. The couple steps outside the church. The villagers smile, and suddenly grains begin to fall around them. Wheat, barley. Why throw food at newlyweds? Fertility. Grain meant life. It meant bread, survival, stability, a good harvest, a strong family. So showering the couple with grain symbolized a wish for abundance and children. It was not meant to be messy for fun. It was serious. It was hopeful. Today we may throw rice, flower petals, or biodegradable confetti. We laugh. We take photos. But the message is still there. May your future grow. Even the vows themselves carry medieval echoes. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not only about romance. It was about community recognition, property, alliances, stability. That is why weddings were public. They happened at the church door or inside the parish in front of witnesses. A private promise in secret could cause problems. If no one saw it, it could be denied. So the community had to hear the words, see the hands join, witness the exchange. Sound familiar? Today we still gather friends and family. We still sign documents. We still have someone officially pronounce the couple married. We may record it on phones now, but the structure is the same. A public promise becomes real through witnesses. And so, across centuries, something steady remains. A circle placed on a finger, a shared vow, a gathering of people who care. The lighting has changed. The music is louder. The dresses may sparkle more. The cake is definitely bigger. But if you could quietly step into that medieval church at dawn, and then step back into a modern wedding this weekend, you might feel something familiar. The emotions are the same. The symbols are the same. And beneath the flowers, the rings, and the laughter, the Middle Ages are still softly present. Just as steady as a bell ringing across a village. Just as unbroken as a circle. Chapter 2: The Workweek. Why we still rest on Sunday. Now that the wedding bells have faded into the distance, let us stay with bells just a little longer. Because in the Middle Ages, bells controlled time. Imagine a small village again. Early morning mist rests low over wooden rooftops. Smoke rises slowly from chimneys. The fields are quiet. Most people do not own clocks. There are no wristwatches, no glowing screens, no alarm tones with cheerful melodies. Instead, there is one sound that matters. The church bell. It rings. And when it rings, people move. In medieval Europe, the church did not only guide faith. It guided the rhythm of life itself. The day was divided not by numbers, but by prayers. These were called the canonical hours. Matins before dawn. Prime in the early morning. Vespers in the evening. You did not check the time. You listened for it. When the bell rang at sunrise, farmers stepped into their fields. When it rang at midday, work paused. When it rang in the evening, tools were set down. Doors were closed. Candles were lit. Life had structure, predictable structure, and in uncertain times, predictability felt safe. But then came Sunday. Sunday was different. On that day, the rhythm slowed. The idea of a sacred day of rest comes from older biblical tradition, but during the Middle Ages it became deeply woven into everyday life. The church strongly reinforced the importance of attending. Massachusetts working on Sunday was discouraged, sometimes even punished. For most villagers, Sunday meant one thing above all. Stop. No plowing. No hammering. No loud market bargaining. Fields rested. Workshops closed. Even traveling merchants slowed down. Instead, families dressed in their best clothing and walked to church together. It was not optional in many places. It was expected. And beyond religion, Sunday became social glue. After Mass, people talked. News was shared. Disputes were settled. Announcements were made. It was the medieval version of both community center and social media feed, just with fewer arguments in the comments section. This weekly pause created something powerful. A rhythm of 6 days of labor, 1 day of rest. Sound familiar? Even today, in many parts of the world, we structure life around a weekend. Saturday and Sunday feel different. Even if we work modern jobs or study online, there is still a psychological shift. Friday evening feels lighter. Sunday feels reflective. That pattern is not accidental. In medieval towns, markets were often scheduled around the religious calendar. Major feast days meant celebration. Certain holy days meant no work. Over time, this created a culture where time itself was sacred. It was not just Monday through Friday. It was a cycle tied to belief. Now imagine living without artificial light, without 24-hour stores, without late-night scrolling. When darkness fell, most activity stopped. Candles were expensive. Firewood took effort. The human body followed natural light more closely. So the workday itself was shaped by the sun and by bells. In the summer, days were longer. Work stretched further. In winter, darkness arrived early and activity slowed. Time was flexible, but the weekly rest was firm. And here is something interesting. The word holiday comes from holy day. Originally, a holiday was a religious feast day, a saint's day, a celebration of something sacred. Work paused. Food was prepared. People gathered. Over centuries, as societies became less strictly religious, many holy days slowly transformed into public holidays. The religious meaning faded for some, but the pause remained. We still take days off. We still mark certain dates as special. Even if we are not thinking about medieval theology when we enjoy a long weekend, the structure traces back there. Now, consider the idea of burnout. Today we talk about work-life balance, about needing rest, about protecting mental health. In medieval life, rest was not framed in psychological terms. It was framed in spiritual ones. Rest was obedience. Rest was sacred duty. To ignore it was not just unhealthy, could be sinful. In a strange way, medieval society built rest directly into its structure. Not because of productivity science, but because of faith. And that weekly reset has never fully disappeared. Of course, not everyone experienced Sunday equally. Lords and nobles had different schedules than peasants. Some labor could not stop completely. Animals still needed care. Fires still needed tending. But the cultural expectation was clear. Sunday was different, quieter, slower, more communal. Now imagine the bell ringing on a Sunday morning. The sound carries across fields, through open windows, over stone walls. People step outside. They walk together. For a moment, work waits. And today, the sound might not be a church bell. It might be a quiet morning without an alarm, a late breakfast, a slower pace, a day when emails feel less urgent. But the feeling is similar, a built-in pause, a breath in the middle of the week. We may think of our weekends as modern inventions, products of labor movements or industrial reform. And yes, history added new layers later. But the heartbeat of a weekly rest day, the idea that time itself should include a sacred pause, was firmly shaped in the Middle Ages. So next time Sunday feels softer, or even slightly heavy with that familiar Sunday evening mood, remember this: hundreds of years ago, in villages of wood and stone, people also felt the week shift. Not because their calendar app told them, but because a bell rang, and everyone listened. Chapter 3: Surnames. How last names became identity. In the early Middle Ages, life was simpler in one small but very confusing way. Most people had only one name. That was it. If your name was John, you were John. If your name was Margaret, you were Margaret. Simple, clean, efficient, until the village grew. Imagine standing in a busy medieval marketplace. Chickens cluck. A blacksmith's hammer rings in the distance. Traders call out prices for bread and cloth. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise, someone shouts, "John!" 5 men turn around. One John sells wool. One John repairs shoes. One John farms barley. One John owes someone money. And one John would prefer not to be noticed at all. This is where surnames quietly entered the story. As towns expanded during the High Middle Ages, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries, populations grew. Trade increased. Records became necessary. Taxes had to be collected. Property had to be tracked. And suddenly, one name was not enough. So people began adding descriptions. John the baker, Margaret from the hill, Thomas, son of Robert. These descriptions slowly became permanent. Occupations were one of the most common sources of surnames. If you were a blacksmith, you might be called Smith. If you milled grain, you became Miller. If you baked bread, baker was a very natural choice. Not extremely creative, but very clear. Over time, these labels stopped being temporary descriptions and started becoming family names. Even if your grandson never touched a hammer in his life, he might still carry the name Smith, which means somewhere in his distant past, someone probably spent a lot of time shaping hot iron. Location-based surnames were also common. If you lived near a forest clearing, you might become Atwood. If your home was near a brook, you might be Brook or Brooks. A person from a town called Lincoln might eventually carry the name Lincoln. In medieval records, names often reflected geography because geography defined life. Travel was limited. Communities were tight. Where you lived mattered deeply. Then there were patronymics. These names were based on your father's name. In parts of Europe, if your father was named Peter, you might be called Peterson. Or in other traditions, Ivan's son might become Ivanov. It simply meant child of. Identity was relational. You were not just yourself. You were someone's son, someone's daughter, part of a line. Now imagine a medieval clerk sitting at a wooden desk, scratching ink onto parchment. He needs to record a land agreement, or a tax payment, or a marriage. "John," he writes. Then he pauses. "Which John?" So he adds more. "John Miller, John of York, John Robertson." Without realizing it, these scribes helped shape how we think about identity even today. Surnames became necessary because administration became more complex. Kingdoms were organizing. Laws were expanding. Written records were increasing. Bureaucracy was slowly growing roots. And bureaucracy loves details. Once a surname appeared in an official document, it gained power. Could be passed down, recognized, inherited. Over generations, these second names stopped changing. They became fixed. What began as a practical solution to marketplace confusion slowly turned into something deeper. A family marker, a connection to ancestry, a quiet reminder of where someone came from. Interestingly, not all surnames were flattering. Some were based on physical traits. Short, long brown, white, Armstrong. Others reflected personality. Stern, strong, swift. Imagine being permanently labeled by something your ancestor did once. One bad haircut in 1283 and your entire bloodline becomes long hair. History can be unforgiving like that. But there is also something comforting about surnames. They link us backward. When you say your full name, you are speaking a small piece of medieval history without realizing it. That second name often carries echoes of trade routes, farming fields, stone villages, and wooden workshops. Even today, surnames still signal heritage. They can hint at geography, culture, language, migration patterns. In the Middle Ages, as people moved between towns or across regions, their surnames often traveled with them. Over time, spelling changed, pronunciation shifted, but the roots remained. And then came coats of arms and heraldry among noble families. Symbols attached to names. Visual identity tied to lineage. While most common villagers did not have elaborate crests, the idea that a family name carried weight became stronger. A name could open doors, or close them, could signal trust, or suspicion. By the late Middle Ages, surnames were becoming firmly established across much of Europe. Not everywhere at the same pace, but steadily. And once established, they rarely disappeared. Today, we sign documents with first and last names. We introduce ourselves that way. Forms require it. Databases store it. Passports display it. Feels natural. But it was once an innovation, born out of crowded markets and expanding kingdoms. So the next time you hear your surname spoken aloud, imagine it whispered across centuries. Imagine a medieval village where someone needed a clearer way to call you across the square. John the Smith, Margaret from the Hill. What began as a simple clarification became a permanent identity. And in that way, every time we write our full name, we are quietly continuing a medieval solution to a very practical problem. Too many Johns, not enough detail, and a world slowly becoming more organized. Chapter 4: Table Manners. Why we eat the way we do. Now imagine that the marketplace noise fades. The day grows darker. Torches are lit along stone walls. Inside a great hall, a long wooden table stretches from one end of the room to the other. Benches line each side. At the far end, slightly raised, sits the lord of the manor. Dinner is about to begin. And believe it or not, many of the small rules you follow at a modern dinner table were shaped in rooms like this. Let us begin with something simple. Your hands. In medieval Europe, forks were rare for a long time. Most people ate with their hands and knives. A personal knife was a common tool. You carried it with you. It cut food, rope, cloth, maybe even defended you in an emergency. Multifunctional, practical, slightly intimidating at dinner. But here is the interesting part. Before eating, guests were expected to wash their hands. Large households provided basins of water and towels. Servants would pour water over the hands of important guests. Clean hands were not just about hygiene. They were about respect. If you were about to share food from common dishes, your cleanliness mattered. That idea has never really left us. Today, washing hands before a meal feels obvious, almost automatic. But in a time without modern germ theory, it was already embedded in etiquette. Now look at the table itself. In medieval halls, there were no individual plates at first. Instead, people often shared trenchers. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. Food was placed on top. Meat juices soaked into it. After the meal, the soaked bread might be eaten or given to the poor. Efficient. Minimal waste. Slightly soggy. Sharing was normal. Several people might eat from the same serving dish. This meant that manners mattered even more. You did not grab wildly. You did not reach across the table. You did not take the best piece for yourself. That would signal greed. Manuals of etiquette began appearing in the later Middle Ages, especially for nobles. They instructed young people not to stuff their mouths too full, not to wipe greasy fingers on their clothes, not to blow their noses into the tablecloth, which suggests that at some point someone absolutely did that, and someone else decided to write it down as a rule. Seating arrangements were also important. The head table mattered. Status determined position. The closer you sat to the lord, the higher your rank. Important guests were placed near the center of attention. Lower-ranking individuals sat farther down the table. Today, we may not have a feudal hierarchy at dinner, but seating still carries meaning. Think about weddings, banquets, even family gatherings. Where someone sits can feel symbolic. Hosts sit at certain spots. Guests of honor are placed carefully. It is a softer version of the medieval system, but the instinct remains. Now let us talk about something very small, but very revealing. Chewing with your mouth closed. Medieval etiquette books advise diners not to speak with a full mouth, not to spit bones onto the table, not to lick their knives aggressively. In other words, the same rules you might gently remind a child about today. These rules developed because dining was communal. It was social. It was visible. A meal was not just about food. It was about order, civility, self-control. In noble households especially, table manners reflected moral character. If you controlled your behavior at the table, you were seen as disciplined, refined, trustworthy, and this idea has quietly survived. Even today, good table manners signal politeness, professionalism, social awareness. A business dinner can influence trust. A formal meal can shape impressions. Now consider prayer before meals. In medieval Christian Europe, grace was commonly said before eating. Food was seen as a blessing. Harvests were uncertain. Famine was a real threat. Giving thanks was not routine politeness. It was sincere gratitude. While modern societies are more diverse in belief, many families still pause before eating. Whether through prayer, reflection, or simple appreciation, the pause remains. The structure remains. Even the courses of a meal have medieval roots. Large feasts were served in waves. Dishes were brought out in sequences. Entertainment sometimes occurred between courses. Music, storytelling, performers, meals were events. And today, at holidays or special occasions, meals still become experiences, not just refueling, but gathering. Even the word companion comes from Latin roots meaning one who shares bread. To eat together was to bond. In medieval life, loyalty was reinforced through shared meals. Alliances were discussed over roasted meats. Marriages were celebrated with feasts. Agreements were sealed at tables. Food built community. Now imagine the Great Hall again. Candlelight flickers against stone walls. The smell of roasted meat fills the air. Conversation hums gently. Cups are raised. Laughter echoes off timber beams. There are rules here, unspoken expectations, a rhythm to how food is passed, how hands move, how people speak. Fast forward to a modern dining room. There may be forks and plates and polished glasses now. Electric light instead of torches. But notice how many small behaviors feel familiar. Wait your turn. Pass the dish politely. Do not interrupt. Do not reach too far. Say thank you. Clean your hands. It is easy to think of table manners as modern social polish, but they were shaped in long halls of wood and stone, where shared food required shared discipline. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden in medieval dining. Eating together requires order, not strict silence, not stiffness, just awareness. And so every time you sit at a table, whether it is a holiday dinner, a casual lunch, or even a quiet meal alone, you are participating in a system of behavior refined centuries ago. Not because someone forced you, but because generations before you discovered that meals work better when people show consideration. And that is a very medieval idea. Simple, practical, and still with us every evening when we gather to eat. Chapter 5: Universities and Graduation Ceremonies. Imagine walking through a narrow cobblestone street at dusk. The sun is fading, and smoke from chimneys drifts lazily into the sky. The faint sound of a bell echoes from a tall tower. You follow it, and it leads you to a large building with arched windows and a heavy wooden door. Inside, the air smells faintly of parchment, ink, and candle wax. Rows of students sit quietly, some reading, others scribbling notes. This is a medieval university. Yes, universities existed in the Middle Ages, though they looked very different from the lecture halls we know today. The first of these institutions appeared in the 11th and 12th centuries. Think of places like the University of Bologna in Italy or Oxford in England. They were centers of learning, of course, but also very, very serious places. Students wore robes from head to toe, not for style, not for fashion, but because robes were practical, warm, and borrowed from clerical attire. The universities were closely tied to the church, so dressing like a monk or cleric was almost mandatory. Imagine trudging through snow in heavy wool robes just to make it to a lecture on logic or theology. Comfort was minimal. Focus was maximal. Lectures were long. Sometimes students stood for hours. The professors, who often held licenses to teach granted by the church, spoke in Latin. Yes, Latin. Every word, every lesson, every debate, Latin. You had to be fluent or be lost. And debates were common. Students questioned, argued, and sometimes even challenged authority. That was the point. Learning was active, even if uncomfortable. And then came the exams. Exams weren't just papers or multiple choice. Oh no, students often had to defend their knowledge publicly. Picture this. A student standing in front of a small crowd of professors and peers, speaking Latin under pressure, sometimes for hours. One mistake could be embarrassing. 3 mistakes and you might have to repeat a year. Degrees in the Middle Ages were more than certificates. They were licenses to teach. A degree meant that you had earned the right to pass your knowledge to others. That idea is surprisingly similar today. We still go to university, earn degrees, and then use them to enter professions or gain respect. Now, the robes and caps we wear at graduation ceremonies, they trace back directly to medieval attire. The square mortarboard hat? Think of it as a tiny, modern echo of the hoods and hats students wore for warmth and distinction. And the tassel? A symbolic gesture of moving from one stage of life to another. Medieval students moved from apprentice scholars to licensed teachers. Today we move from students to graduates. The ceremony itself, often held in a large hall or cathedral, was formal, almost sacred. Candles flickered along the walls. Students processed slowly. The degree was conferred with words spoken aloud. Public recognition was everything. It wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about being accepted into a community of learned individuals. You became part of a lineage, a tradition that stretched back decades, even centuries. And universities weren't just about academics. They were also social hubs. Students lived in dorms, ate together, and formed guild-like societies. Rivalries could be fierce, but friendships lasted a lifetime. Think of it as a mix of strict schooling and boarding school drama. In some cases, townsfolk were wary of students, especially if they were rowdy, but students also contributed to the local economy by buying food, renting rooms, and attending churches. Now, let's pause for a little humor. Imagine a medieval student sneaking a loaf of bread into the lecture hall because the kitchen ran out of porridge, or someone trying to hide a rodent that snuck into their dorm. Not everything was solemn debate and Latin grammar. There was life and there was chaos. Fast forward to today, and university life still has echoes of this. Dormitories, clubs, campus debates, and yes, all-nighters, probably fueled by coffee instead of mead, are reminders that the human experience of learning hasn't changed that much. We still live in a micro-community, still follow schedules, and still celebrate achievements publicly. Graduation ceremonies also remind us of medieval traditions in another way. They are structured, formal, and slightly theatrical. Students process in order. They are recognized by name. There is music. There is applause. And, yes, there is the symbolic movement of tassels, caps, or gowns to mark advancement. The ritual conveys status, accomplishment, and transition, just like it did centuries ago. Even the idea of academic hierarchy, such as bachelor, master, and doctor, comes directly from medieval systems. A bachelor's degree meant you had completed initial studies. A master's degree meant you could teach. A doctorate often meant you had achieved the highest level of authority in your subject. That structure survives today in our degree titles and the way universities organize learning. Medieval universities also established rules that still resonate. Honor codes, expectations of conduct, and ethical obligations to teachers and peers were critical. Cheating was a serious offense. Respect for authority mattered. Being late wasn't just rude, it could affect your reputation permanently. Some things never change. So, as you think about a modern graduation ceremony, remember the flickering candlelight, the echoing Latin, and the students nervously waiting to be recognized hundreds of years ago. Every ritual, every step, Every robe has a story reaching back into medieval halls. And here's the quiet magic. When you toss your cap in the air, smile for photos, and hug your friends, you are participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. The ceremony is modern, yes, but its roots are profoundly old. Medieval universities taught more than subjects. They taught order, discipline, respect, and community. They taught that knowledge was public, shared, and celebrated. And they created rituals that would endure, linking learning with ceremony, personal achievement with communal recognition. In other words, the next time you see a graduation procession, remember, you are walking in the footsteps of students who lived in stone halls, listened to bells, wore heavy robes, and nervously awaited the word licentiate or magister. Their experience shaped the traditions we still follow today. And in that way, medieval universities were not just schools. They were the birthplace of a ritual that celebrates human learning and achievement in a way that resonates even in the soft glow of our modern lecture halls. Knowledge, ceremony, and recognition, all echoing across centuries. And with that thought, we can gently leave the candlelit halls of medieval scholars and step into the next chapter. The warmth, the music, and the feast of medieval Christmas traditions. Chapter 6: Christmas Traditions. Feasts, carols, and Yule roots. Imagine a quiet medieval village at dusk in December. The sky is gray, smoke curls lazily from chimneys, and snow might dust the rooftops, though not every year is snowy. The air smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and spices. In the distance, a church bell rings, announcing that Christmas is near. People walk more slowly now, bundled in wool and furs. There is anticipation in the air, not just for gifts, but for community, warmth, and ritual. Christmas, as we know it today, has deep medieval roots. Many traditions we take for granted. Singing carols, sharing special foods, lighting candles, even decorating with evergreens, emerged or were solidified during the Middle Ages. Let's begin with the feast. Food was central to medieval Christmas celebrations. Most of the year, people ate simply porridge, bread, vegetables, maybe a little meat if they were lucky. But Christmas was different. It was a time to celebrate abundance, community, and survival. Meat, pies, roasted birds, and sweets appeared on tables. Mince pies were not tiny dessert snacks like today. They were often large, rich with meat, suet, dried fruits, and spices imported from far-off lands. Spices were expensive, so using them at Christmas was a way to show status and generosity. Communal feasting was about more than just eating. People gathered, neighbors mingled, stories were shared, and children watched the adults carefully, learning how to behave in polite society. A feast reinforced community bonds, celebrated survival through a long winter, and marked the year's turning point toward longer days. And then there were the carols. Carols were not just songs for entertainment. They were often tied to religious storytelling. Villagers might gather in a church or around a fire to sing songs recounting the nativity story, saints' lives, or other moral tales. Carols helped people, many of whom could not read, remember, and celebrate religious history. Music was communal and participatory. Everyone joined in, and the repetition of songs across years helped embed tradition in a way that text alone could not. Some carols even involved dancing. People would form circles, hold hands, and step in rhythm to the music. The combination of song, movement, and story created a memorable, joyful experience. Modern Christmas carols and festive dances owe much to these medieval practices. When you sing Silent Night or deck the halls today, you are echoing centuries-old habits of shared music and celebration. Now let's talk about the Yule log. Burning a log at Christmas may feel cozy and familiar. In medieval Europe, the Yule log had more than aesthetic purposes. It was a ritual symbol, a way to bring light and warmth into the darkest days of winter. People believed that the fire brought protection, luck, and a sense of community. Some families saved embers from year to year to ignite the next year's Yule log, linking each season to the last. Decoration with evergreens, holly, ivy, fir branches also has medieval roots. In a world where deciduous trees were bare and the landscape looked gray and lifeless, bringing greenery indoors symbolized life, continuity, and protection from evil spirits. Holly's sharp leaves were thought to ward off malevolent forces. Ivy represented fidelity and eternal life. These symbolic decorations became central to festive practice and evolved into the Christmas trees and wreaths we recognize today. Gift-giving is another tradition with deep medieval ties. In early medieval Europe, gifts were often modest, small tokens of respect or symbolic items. Among the wealthy, gifts could be more extravagant: gold, silver, fine fabrics, or books. Gifts were also tied to the church calendar, particularly the feast of St. Nicholas on December 6th, whose charitable acts inspired many customs of generosity and exchange during the season. The idea that giving expresses community, love, and shared joy comes from this period, even if Santa Claus and commercial culture came much later. Here is a little medieval humor for you. Imagine a servant hiding a goose in the kitchen, hoping to save it for the Lord's table, only to be discovered moments before the feast. Or a child sneaking pieces of sweetmeat before the adults arrived. These small acts of mischief probably happened every year. They remind us that holiday traditions are both serious and playful, a balance we still recognize in our own celebrations. Lighting was another element. Candles and fires were essential literally and symbolically. Candles illuminated dark rooms, making gatherings safer and more cheerful. Symbolically, light represented hope, warmth, and divine presence. Today's Christmas lights, whether on trees or along rooftops, carry forward that desire to bring brightness into long winter nights. Another interesting medieval custom was the Lord of Misrule. In some towns, a designated person, often a lower-ranked servant, was chosen to preside over festivities. They could organize games, mischief, and humorous chaos. The idea was to temporarily invert social order for fun. Sounds a little like our modern office holiday parties, doesn't it? Even today, some festive traditions allow a break from everyday rules, reminding us that joy often thrives in playful subversion. Church calendars strongly influenced when celebrations occurred. Many towns observed multiple feast days in December and January, each with slightly different customs. Villagers would fast before major celebrations, then feast. They would attend special services, sing, and share bread or cakes. Over time, these practices layered onto each other, producing a complex web of rituals that influenced later holiday behavior. Finally, consider the communal aspect. Christmas in the Middle Ages was less about individualism and more about togetherness. Villagers came together to eat, sing, pray, and perform. Even the coldest winters could feel warmer when shared with neighbors. Today, our holiday gatherings, family dinners, and even virtual celebrations carry the same intent: community, connection, and a break from ordinary life. So, as you hang lights, sing carols, or bake cookies this season, remember, you are participating in centuries-old practices. You are joining a tradition that medieval villagers carefully preserved through rituals, feasts, songs, and fires. You are, in a very real sense, carrying a bit of medieval Europe into the modern day. Even small gestures, the flicker of a candle, the decoration of a tree, the warmth of a shared meal, connect you to people who lived hundreds of years ago. People who, like you, wanted light, joy, and togetherness during the darkest part of the year. And in that way, medieval Christmas is not gone. It is quietly, softly, and warmly alive in every tradition we maintain, in every song we sing, and in every meal we share. Chapter 7: Trial by Jury and Courtroom Rituals. Imagine walking along a narrow cobblestone street in a medieval town. Smoke curls from chimneys, and in the distance you hear the toll of a bell. A crowd gathers outside a large stone building. This is the local court. Today, justice will be served, or at least attempted. Many of the courtroom customs we still follow have their roots here, in the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, justice was a public affair. Trials weren't private matters between an accused and a judge. Villagers came to watch. Witnesses were called openly. Stories were told aloud. This was as much about educating the public as it was about punishing crime. Seeing justice in action reminded people of rules, expectations, and consequences. One of the most enduring legacies of the Middle Ages is the jury system. Today, we think of juries as groups of ordinary people deciding guilt or innocence. Back then, jurors served a slightly different purpose. Early juries were often neighbors or community members asked to testify about what they knew. Their testimony represented local knowledge and social accountability more than modern proof. In a trial, everyone had a role. The judge, often a local lord or appointed official, sat on a raised platform, symbolizing authority. Clerks recorded proceedings. The accused stood before the court. Witnesses stepped forward. Everyone listened closely because words mattered, sometimes more than physical evidence. Oral testimony was central, and the emphasis on speech and sworn words still echoes in modern courtrooms. Now, let's talk about trial by ordeal, a practice that might sound bizarre today. In the early Middle Ages, some cases, especially those without witnesses, were decided by physical tests believed to reveal divine judgment. A person might have to hold a hot iron, plunge a hand into boiling water, or carry a heavy stone. If the wounds healed properly, it was seen as proof of innocence. If not, well, the outcome could be fatal. The idea was simple: God would protect the innocent. It seems extreme, but it shows how intertwined religion and law were. Over time, trial by ordeal faded, replaced by evidence, sworn testimony, and community judgment. But the underlying principle remains. The court seeks truth, fairness, and order, and the presence of witnesses matters. Today, we no longer test fire or water, but we still rely on testimony, cross-examination, and impartial observation. Oaths were another crucial ritual. Witnesses, jurors, and defendants swore on holy objects, relics, Bibles, or crosses, to tell the truth. Breaking the oath was not just a legal problem but a spiritual one. The fear of divine punishment reinforced honesty. Modern courts still require oaths, though now more formal than spiritual. The principle is the same: truth matters. Courtroom language also has medieval roots. Terms like plaintiff, defendant, gavel, and voir dire come from this period. Even the formality of addressing a judge as Your Honor reflects centuries of ritual emphasizing authority and respect. Medieval courts were theatrical in their own way. They wanted everyone to understand that law was powerful, respected, and serious. Consider courtroom layout. In medieval halls, the judge sat higher than everyone else, symbolizing authority. The accused stood in the center, visible to all. The public observed from benches or standing. This reinforced hierarchy and social order. Modern courts still follow similar patterns. Judges elevated, jury visible, public galleries present. The symbolism of position and visibility endures. Punishments were public spectacles. Fines, stocks, public whippings, or executions served as deterrents. People learned rules not just by reading them but by watching consequences unfold. Today, punishment is more private, but the medieval principle of public accountability remains in laws, regulations, and transparency of court proceedings. Legal counsel began to appear in the later Middle Ages. Advocates or lawyers represented clients, studied procedure, and argued points. Modern lawyers trace their professional lineage directly to these medieval advocates. The combination of education, rhetoric, and ethics has remained central to law ever since. Gestures and decorum mattered, too. When a judge entered, the court rose. Witnesses bowed, and lawyers presented documents carefully. These gestures emphasized respect and seriousness. modern traditions, standing for the judge, addressing the court formally, come from these medieval practices. Imagine, for a moment, a medieval witness mispronouncing Latin terms while pointing to a neighbor accused of stealing hay, or a juror dozing off after a long morning of testimony. Court was serious, yes, but it was human too. People erred, argued, and joked quietly. In that way, it wasn't so different from modern courtrooms, where humans, judges, jurors, lawyers, bring both seriousness and personality. The principle of impartiality began to develop over time. Legal reforms emphasized fairness, careful consideration of evidence, and balanced verdicts. These ideas were not codified immediately but emerged through practice, laying the groundwork for modern justice. Fairness, accountability, and due process. Record-keeping was another medieval innovation. Clerks wrote down proceedings, agreements, and sentences. These records allowed for appeals, historical reference, and consistent application of law. Modern court transcripts and legal documentation descend directly from these efforts. So, when you step into a modern courtroom, stand as a witness, or watch a trial on TV, remember, many rituals, the oaths, the formal language, the hierarchy of seats, even the attire, come from medieval Europe. The system evolved, yes, but the foundations remained surprisingly strong. Medieval courts were public, ritualized, and sometimes dramatic. They were not perfect, and some practices seem strange or harsh today. Yet the core idea persists. Law is a communal, structured way to manage society, hold people accountable, and maintain order. Every courtroom echoes those medieval halls. Every oath, every raised hand, every judge's gavel is part of a centuries-old story about fairness, truth, and community. When you hear "all rise" or see someone swear to tell the truth, picture a medieval hall filled with villagers, a judge perched on a high seat, candles flickering, and people paying attention to every word. The ritual continues, the lessons endure, and the story of law is still very much alive. Chapter 8: Guilds and Apprenticeships. Imagine walking down a bustling medieval street. The sun glints off timber-framed houses, and the smell of fresh bread and smoky forges fills the air. Craftsmen work openly in their shops, calling out to customers and apprentices alike. Hammers strike metal, looms hum, and potters shape clay on spinning wheels. This was the heart of the medieval economy. The guilds. Many of the professional practices, apprenticeships, and trade rituals we recognize today started here. Guilds were organizations of craftsmen or merchants who shared the same trade. Blacksmiths, weavers, masons, bakers, and goldsmiths all formed guilds to protect their trade, maintain quality, and control pricing. Think of it as a medieval professional union, but with rituals, symbols, and a strong sense of community. Membership wasn't casual. To join, one had to apprentice for years, prove skill, and earn approval from established members. Apprenticeships were the core of guild life. A young person, often a boy, sometimes a girl in specific trades, would be bound to a master for several years. They learned by doing, sweeping the floor, preparing materials, and slowly mastering techniques. Apprentices lived with the master's family, sharing meals and routines, learning not just craft but also discipline, punctuality, and loyalty. Life was strict. Mistakes were corrected sharply. But learning was hands-on, immersive, and practical, far different from today's classroom-only approach. Once an apprentice completed training, they became a journeyman. This stage allowed more independence but still required guidance. Journeymen might travel to different towns to work, gain experience, and build a reputation. The journey taught adaptability, introduced new techniques, and sometimes provided the connections needed to eventually become a master. Modern internships, residencies, or trade rotations owe their origins to this system. Becoming a master wasn't just about skill. It was about recognition by peers. A journeyman often had to produce a masterpiece, a work demonstrating exceptional skill. Only then could they open their own shop and take apprentices. Today, degrees, certifications, or licensing exams reflect this same principle. demonstrate skill, earn recognition, and join a professional community. Guilds also regulated trade. They set prices, determined quality standards, and resolved disputes among members. If a baker made bad bread or a shoemaker sold shoddy shoes, the guild could fine them, expel them, or require corrective measures. This ensured public trust. Customers could rely on guild members to meet certain standards, a medieval form of consumer protection. Modern licensing boards, quality standards, and trade regulations reflect this concern. Guilds were deeply social. They held feasts, religious observances, and celebrations. Saints' days were marked with gatherings, processions, and competitions. Members bonded over more than work. They formed networks of support. In times of sickness, guilds often provided care for members or their families. Today's professional associations, trade unions, and networking organizations continue this tradition of combining business with community. Ceremony was important. When an apprentice became a journeyman, there might be a formal declaration or public recognition. When a journeyman became a master, celebrations followed, often with feasts, music, and acknowledgement. These rituals reinforced hierarchy, encouraged respect, and celebrated achievement. Modern graduations, award ceremonies, or professional inductions echo these medieval traditions. Guilds influenced urban life. Medieval towns often revolved around trade districts, with guild halls serving as centers of commerce and governance. These halls were more than offices. They were symbolic homes for their trades. Meetings, feasts, and legal matters were conducted here. Modern professional headquarters, trade associations, and industry centers carry on this role. Imagine the daily life of a young apprentice. Dawn rises and they light the candle or start the fire in the workshop. They sweep floors, fetch materials, and observe the master. As the day progresses, they slowly gain hands-on experience, stretching leather, mixing dyes, or forging metal. By evening, exhausted but attentive, they reflect on the day's lessons. Over years, these repeated, small acts built skill, patience, and confidence. Modern apprenticeships, vocational schools, and internships follow the same philosophy. Immersive practice combined with mentorship. Guilds also had moral expectations. Honesty, punctuality, and respect were essential. Cheating, laziness, or arrogance could get a member expelled. Ethics weren't optional. They were enforced by peers and overseen by guild officers. This combination of skill and morality helped maintain trust within the trade and the community. Many modern professions, medicine, law, engineering, still emphasize ethical standards alongside technical expertise, a direct echo of medieval practices. Finally, guilds contributed to innovation. As members traveled, exchanged techniques, and competed, new methods and designs emerged. Knowledge sharing, observation, and experimentation, key principles of innovation today, were embedded in medieval guild culture. The medieval workshop was both a classroom and a laboratory, teaching lessons that remain relevant in modern professional and creative work. So, when you think of internships, vocational training, professional licensing, or trade associations today, remember, guilds and apprenticeships from the Middle Ages shaped them. They created a structure where skill, honor, and learning thrived together. And when an apprentice finally became a master, celebrated by peers and the public, they were part of a story connecting generations, trade, and society itself. Next time you attend a professional event, trade show, or class, picture a medieval workshop, tools clattering, a master guiding a nervous apprentice, and a guild hall filled with chatter, celebration, and learning. The past is quietly alive in the practices we still follow today. Chapter 9: Medieval Medicine and Remedies. Picture yourself in a small medieval village. The streets are narrow, the air smells of smoke and herbs, and someone coughs nearby. A local healer, sometimes called a barber surgeon or wise woman, is preparing to treat a sick villager. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a mix of observation, superstition, and trial and error. Surprisingly, many of the remedies, ideas, and rituals from that time shaped the way medicine developed for centuries afterward. Healthcare in medieval Europe was very different from today. There were no hospitals as we know them, well, not until the later Middle Ages, and even then they were small and often run by religious orders. Most people relied on local healers, apothecaries, or monks. Monasteries preserved medical knowledge in books called herbals and manuscripts, describing plants, diseases, and treatments. These texts were copied painstakingly by hand and often included illustrations of herbs, tools, and anatomy. Herbs were the primary medicine. Leaves, roots, flowers, and barks were gathered, dried, and mixed into teas, ointments, or poultices. For a headache, one might use willow bark. For a wound, sage or rosemary. People believed in the power of natural remedies, combined with prayers and rituals. Modern herbal medicine still echoes some of these practices. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, which is a chemical ancestor of aspirin. The medieval understanding of the body was influenced heavily by the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was believed to depend on balance. Illness meant one humor was too high or too low. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and diet adjustments. While it might sound strange or even dangerous today, this focus on balance shows that medieval doctors were thinking systematically about the body, trying to find patterns and causes for disease. Barber surgeons were common, especially for injuries. They cut hair, performed minor surgeries, and even extracted teeth. They carried tools like knives, leeches, and cups for bloodletting. Despite the limited knowledge, these practitioners often saved lives, especially in villages far from trained physicians. Modern surgical practices and hygiene standards have roots in these early attempts to intervene directly in the body, even if medieval methods were risky. Religion played a central role in healing. Many people believed that prayers, charms, or relics could cure illness. Pilgrimages to holy sites were sometimes recommended for chronic conditions. Churches often offered healing as part of spiritual care. The connection between faith and medicine was strong, showing that healing was not just physical but emotional and communal as well. Today, holistic approaches to medicine, considering mental, spiritual, and physical well-being, echo this medieval perspective. Diseases were poorly understood. Smallpox, leprosy, plague, and fevers struck communities unpredictably. Physicians used observation, astrology, and careful record-keeping to predict outbreaks and treat patients. Hospitals, when available, focused on care rather than cure. Patients were fed, kept warm, and offered herbal remedies, but doctors often acknowledged their limits. This humility is a lesson modern medicine still values. Knowing what you can and cannot do is crucial for safe treatment. Surgery was particularly dramatic. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, operations were painful and risky. Yet barbers and surgeons learned techniques that would evolve into safer methods. Cauterization, for instance, was used to stop bleeding, while simple stitches helped close wounds. The courage of both healer and patient in facing these challenges laid the groundwork for the surgical advances that would come centuries later. Home remedies were widespread. Families passed down recipes for balms, teas, and poultices. Honey, for instance, was prized for its antibacterial properties. Garlic was believed to strengthen the body and ward off disease. These simple, natural solutions often worked better than people realized, showing that practical experience combined with observation was a key part of medieval medicine. Interestingly, hygiene was a mixture of superstition and observation. Public baths existed in some towns, and washing hands was recommended for surgeons and physicians. Yet people also feared contamination in ways that seem odd today, like avoiding certain foods or places during epidemics. Despite the gaps in knowledge, medieval communities understood that cleanliness and isolation could help prevent disease. Modern public health practices like quarantine and sanitation echo these early lessons. Plagues, especially the Black Death in the 14th century, shaped medicine profoundly. The massive loss of life forced doctors and communities to rethink treatments, record symptoms, and develop quarantine practices. Though the science was rudimentary, the response created an early form of epidemiology, tracking disease patterns, attempting to isolate outbreaks, and learning from observation. Today's disease control and epidemiology have roots in these medieval crises. Another fascinating aspect was astrology. Many doctors consulted the stars before performing treatments. They believed the positions of planets influenced the body's humors. While this seems strange now, it demonstrates medieval physicians' desire to find patterns in nature and align treatment with perceived cosmic forces. Pattern seeking is still central in modern diagnostics, though now guided by science rather than astrology. Women played a key role in healthcare. Wise women, midwives, and herbalists treated injuries, delivered babies, and cared for the sick. Their knowledge, often passed orally, was practical and effective. While not always officially recognized, these women preserved traditions, shared remedies, and were crucial to community health. Modern midwifery and herbal medicine owe much to these medieval practitioners. So, when you sip a herbal tea, use honey on a cut, or practice basic hygiene, remember, many of these ideas started hundreds of years ago. Medieval medicine was a combination of trial and error, observation, and community care. It may have been imperfect, sometimes dangerous, but it laid the foundation for centuries of learning. The next time you visit a doctor, pharmacist, or hospital, think of the medieval healer, tending to patients with herbs, prayer, and dedication. Their curiosity, patience, and willingness to observe the human body quietly shaped the medicine we know today. Chapter 10: Education and Universities. Picture yourself in a quiet medieval town, the morning sun spilling over stone buildings and narrow streets. Children are running along cobblestones, carrying small bundles of parchment, and heading to the local school, or perhaps to a tutor's home. In the distance, the bells of a cathedral or a university tower chime, signaling the start of lessons. Education in the Middle Ages was a mixture of religious instruction, practical skills, and the beginnings of formalized scholarship. And many of the structures, ideas, and traditions we still see in universities today began here. Most education in the early Middle Ages took place in monasteries and cathedral schools. Monks taught reading, writing, Latin, and religious texts. These schools were primarily for boys destined for religious life, though some towns offered instruction for merchants' sons and others. The focus was on literacy, understanding scripture, and learning moral and social rules. Yet, alongside Latin grammar and religious studies, students often learned arithmetic, music, and astronomy, skills that would later become part of broader curricula. By the 12th century, universities began to emerge. Bologna, Paris, and Oxford were among the earliest, attracting scholars from across Europe. Unlike modern universities, these were small communities where students often studied under a single master or teacher for extended periods. The master would lecture from texts, sometimes reading aloud while students took notes, a bit like today's lecture halls, but without projectors and slides. Learning was slow, deliberate, and often oral. The curriculum was divided into stages. Students first studied the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. These subjects trained the mind to think, reason, and communicate clearly. Later, they progressed to the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This combination of verbal and mathematical training formed the foundation for advanced studies in law, medicine, and theology. Many universities still maintain traces of this division, reflecting centuries of intellectual tradition. Education was not cheap. Students often paid fees for instruction, books, and sometimes room and board. Many lived in hostels crowded with other scholars. Meals were simple, often bread, cheese, and ale. Discipline was strict. Masters expected attention, punctuality, and memorization. Students could be fined, disciplined, or even expelled for misbehavior. Despite the challenges, medieval education offered a pathway to social mobility, intellectual growth, and professional opportunity. Lectures were central to learning. Masters read from authoritative texts, while students copied notes and occasionally debated concepts. Debate and disputation were essential. Scholars argued, questioned, and defended ideas in front of peers, fostering critical thinking. Modern classrooms, discussion groups, and oral exams echo this medieval emphasis on active engagement and reasoned argument. Degrees began as a way to certify knowledge and authority. A student might earn a bachelor's degree, signaling readiness for further study, and eventually a master's or doctor's degree. This hierarchical structure, bachelor, master, doctor, remains in modern universities worldwide. Even today, graduation ceremonies, robes, and formal recognition draw directly from medieval tradition. Religious influence was strong. Most universities were under church supervision, and theology was considered the highest subject. Yet, other disciplines gradually gained respect. Law, medicine, philosophy, and the arts were incorporated. The balance between faith and reason shaped intellectual inquiry and set the stage for later scientific and humanistic developments. Today's liberal arts and professional degrees trace their roots back to this system. Books were precious. Manuscripts were hand-copied, often on vellum, and richly illustrated. Students relied on a few texts, sometimes sharing them in small groups. Libraries in universities and monasteries became centers of learning, preserving knowledge that might have been lost otherwise. Modern libraries, digital archives, and research collections owe their existence to these early repositories. Interestingly, student life had its own culture. Scholars lived in close quarters, often forming guild-like associations called nations, based on their region of origin. They organized meals, debates, and sometimes pranks. The medieval student experience was social as well as intellectual, a balance we still see in campus life today with clubs, fraternities, and student societies. Teaching methods emphasized memorization and repetition. Students might spend hours reciting Latin grammar, learning biblical passages, or practicing logic exercises. Examinations were oral, sometimes public, and often intimidating. But this rigorous training produced skilled scholars capable of thinking critically, speaking persuasively, and writing eloquently, skills that remain central in education today. Universities also became hubs for knowledge exchange. Scholars traveled between institutions, bringing ideas, texts, and innovations with them. This mobility spread learning across Europe, creating a shared intellectual culture. Today's academic conferences, exchange programs, and international collaboration echo this medieval tradition of scholarly travel and idea sharing. Another important aspect was mentorship. Masters guided individual students, offering advice, instruction, and sometimes protection. The relationship could last years, creating lifelong intellectual bonds. Modern mentorship, advising, and research supervision continue this practice, emphasizing personalized guidance alongside formal instruction. The Middle Ages also saw the emergence of professional schools within universities. Medicine, law, and theology required specialized study, practical experience, and examination. These early professional programs established the idea that knowledge must be both learned and applied, a principle still central to professional education. So, when you walk across a modern campus, sit in a lecture hall, or watch students debate ideas, remember, many of these practices, from lectures to degrees to mentorship, began in the medieval universities. They were designed to cultivate knowledge, critical thinking, and moral character, preparing students not just for careers, but for thoughtful participation in society. The medieval student, carrying manuscripts, debating logic, or observing nature, laid the groundwork for centuries of intellectual tradition. Modern education, with its classrooms, diplomas, libraries, and debates, is very much a continuation of that story. And when you think of universities today, imagine the quiet medieval halls, the smell of ink and parchment, and the passionate pursuit of knowledge that started it all. Chapter 11: Medieval Art, Architecture, and Symbolism. Imagine stepping into a grand medieval cathedral. The sunlight streams through towering stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on stone floors. The air smells faintly of incense and old stone. Every detail, the soaring arches, the carved statues, the painted frescoes, tells a story. Art and architecture in the Middle Ages were not just decoration. They were visual languages meant to teach, inspire, and express ideas. Many elements of today's design, symbolism, and architecture have their roots in this period. Medieval art was deeply intertwined with religion. Churches, monasteries, and cathedrals were the main patrons of artists. Paintings, sculptures, and carvings often depicted biblical stories, saints, and moral lessons. This was a time before mass literacy, so images served as a kind of visual textbook. Villagers could read the Bible through images, learning stories of faith, virtue, and sin even if they could not read Latin. Color played a symbolic role. Blue, often derived from expensive lapis lazuli, represented heaven and purity. Red could signify passion, blood, or martyrdom. Gold leaf conveyed divine light. These color choices weren't random, they communicated meaning. Modern design and film still rely on color to convey mood and symbolism, echoing medieval practices. Architecture was equally symbolic. Gothic cathedrals, with their pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, reached skyward, creating a sense of awe. The vertical lines drew eyes heavenward, reminding worshippers of the divine. Light, filtered through stained glass, created a mystical atmosphere, symbolizing the presence of God. Many of these architectural principles, emphasis on height, light, and movement, continue to inspire modern religious and public buildings. Sculpture and reliefs were used to tell stories. Tympanums above church doors often depicted the Last Judgment, warning viewers of heaven and hell. Capitals on columns might show biblical scenes or fantastical creatures. Every carved figure served a didactic purpose. Modern storytelling in public spaces, murals, monuments, and statues, follows a similar tradition, teaching or commemorating through imagery. Manuscript illumination was another hallmark of medieval art. Monks or scribes decorated books with intricate initials, borders, and miniature scenes. Gold and bright pigments made the pages shine. These illuminated manuscripts were treasured, both for their beauty and for the knowledge they contained. Today's illustrated books, decorative calligraphy, and graphic design echo this attention to visual storytelling. Symbolism extended beyond churches. Heraldry, coats of arms, banners, and shields identified families, knights, and regions. Colors, animals, and patterns conveyed lineage, loyalty, and personal achievements. Modern logos, emblems, and branding take inspiration from this medieval practice of communicating identity through symbols. Daily life was reflected in art too. Tapestries, frescoes, and carvings often depicted scenes of agriculture, hunting, festivals, and marketplaces. These images preserved a visual record of medieval society. Today, documentary films, photography, and historical illustrations continue this tradition of recording everyday life for future generations. Architecture also reflected social hierarchy. Castles, manor houses, and city walls were designed to convey power and authority. Defensive features, towers, moats, and battlements served practical purposes, but their imposing appearance also sent a message about control and strength. Public buildings, like town halls and guild halls, conveyed civic pride and community organization. Modern urban design and monumental architecture echo this balance of function and symbolism. Cathedrals were sometimes called books in stone because every feature, from the sculptures to the stained glass, carried meaning. Angels, saints, and mythical creatures were carefully placed to guide worshippers' understanding of morality, the cosmos, and human destiny. This approach, using visual design to teach, inspire, or provoke thought, remains central in modern architecture and art installations. Artists also experimented with perspective, proportion, and realism, even if imperfectly. Early medieval art was often flat and symbolic, but by the late Middle Ages, painters began exploring depth, shadow, and movement. These experiments laid the groundwork for Renaissance art and the development of realistic depiction. Today's visual media, from cinema to digital art, can trace part of its lineage back to these explorations. Religious rituals and symbols often appeared in art. Candles, crosses, chalices, and holy books were depicted to remind viewers of sacred practices. Even mundane objects, like baskets or animals, could carry symbolic meaning. Modern filmmakers, painters, and designers continue to use objects as visual metaphors, a technique perfected in medieval symbolism. Urban spaces were enhanced by architecture and art. Town squares, fountains, and guild halls were often decorated with carvings, statues, and coats of arms. This created a sense of civic pride and identity. Modern city planning, public art, and landmarks continue this tradition of making space meaningful and expressive. The construction of cathedrals and major public buildings required enormous collaboration. Architects, masons, carpenters, glassmakers, and sculptors worked together, often for decades. This teamwork, planning, and innovation resemble modern collaborative projects, from skyscrapers to museums. The idea of combining diverse skills for a shared vision remains central in contemporary design and construction. Medieval art and architecture were also about storytelling across generations. Buildings stood for centuries, conveying faith, social order, and artistic achievement long after their creators passed. Modern museums, heritage sites, and monuments perform the same role, preserving human creativity and cultural memory. So, the next time you walk into a cathedral, visit a museum, or admire a historic building, remember the medieval artists and builders. Their work combined beauty, symbolism, and function, creating spaces that educated, inspired, and connected people. Every arch, every stained glass window, every carved figure carries a story that began centuries ago but still speaks to us today. The Middle Ages might seem distant, but through art and architecture, their worldview, creativity, and values remain visible. They remind us that art is never just decoration. It's a way to communicate, to teach, and to connect generations across time. Chapter 12: Food, Feasts, and Culinary Traditions. Imagine stepping into a medieval hall. The smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and herbs fills the air. Torches flicker on stone walls, and long wooden tables are set for a feast. Food in the Middle Ages was more than sustenance. It was a reflection of social status, culture, and tradition. Many of the culinary habits, festival meals, and eating rituals we know today started in this period. For most villagers, daily meals were simple. Bread was the staple, often coarse and dark. Porridge, gruel, and seasonal vegetables accompanied it. Meat was a luxury, reserved for wealthier families or special occasions. Cheese, eggs, and legumes supplemented the diet. People ate with their hands or simple utensils and shared food communally. Meals were practical, designed to provide energy for labor-intensive lives. Spices were highly prized, imported from distant lands. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were expensive and used to show wealth and sophistication. Nobles and merchants would host feasts spiced with extravagance, both to impress guests and display their status. Today's love for international flavors, gourmet dishes, and exotic spices echoes this medieval fascination. Feasts were central to social and religious life. Celebrations for holidays, weddings, or significant events often lasted hours, sometimes days. Tables were filled with multiple courses, including meats, pies, breads, fruits, and desserts like sweet tarts. Food was often theatrical. Roasted animals might appear with elaborate garnishes, and cooks sometimes shaped food into fantastical forms. Modern banquets, catering, and elaborate dinner parties carry on this sense of spectacle and celebration. Meals followed rules of etiquette which varied by class. Nobles were served by attendants, with knives, spoons, and occasionally forks, while peasants shared simple utensils or ate with fingers. Hand-washing before and after meals was a ritual in noble households, sometimes accompanied by scented water. Today's table manners and dining etiquette have roots in these medieval practices. Guilds also influenced food culture. Bakers, butchers, and brewers belonged to guilds that controlled production, quality, and pricing. Townsfolk could trust a guild baker to provide good bread or a brewer to make safe ale. Guild regulations ensured consistency, which is similar to modern food standards and quality certifications. Hunting and fishing were important for both sustenance and social prestige. Nobles maintained hunting grounds and employed gamekeepers. Hunting provided venison, boar, and birds for feasts, while peasants relied on local rivers, lakes, and forests. Seasonal foods, dictated by availability, shaped culinary traditions. Today, the farm-to-table movement and seasonal menus reflect a similar respect for what is locally and naturally available. Herbs and spices were also used for health. People believed certain flavors could balance humors, aid digestion, or prevent illness. Sage, rosemary, thyme, and garlic were common in cooking, both for taste and medicinal properties. Modern cooking and herbal practices still honor this dual role of flavor and wellness. Beverages were central to medieval dining. Ale was consumed daily, safer than water in many towns, and provided calories. Wine was more common among the wealthy, used for both pleasure and ritual. Spiced wine, mead, and flavored alesh were popular for feasts. Today's appreciation for craft beer, wine tasting, and specialty drinks echoes medieval experimentation with flavors and fermentation. Bread was not just food, but also a social symbol. Different types of bread signified class and wealth. Coarse rye or barley bread was common among peasants, while fine white wheat bread graced noble tables. Sharing bread could be a gesture of hospitality, and breaking bread together reinforced social bonds, a tradition that continues in modern communal meals. Desserts were often simple but sweet. Honey, fruit preserves, and almond-based pastries were common among the wealthy. Sugar, imported at high cost, was a luxury. Presentation was as important as taste, with shaped pastries and decorated dishes signaling skill and status. Modern pastries, confectionaries, and fancy desserts echo this focus on both flavor and appearance. Festivals amplified culinary creativity. Christmas, Easter, and harvest celebrations featured large tables laden with multiple dishes, spiced meats, pies, breads, and sweets. Communities celebrated not only the season, but also shared identity and tradition through food. Modern holiday meals and cultural celebrations carry the same spirit. Food as a connector of family, community, and memory. Meals also reflected hierarchy and ritual. Nobles were served first, guests were ranked by status, and utensils or seating arrangements reinforced social order. Even the act of tasting new dishes or judging a cook could carry social significance. Modern state dinners, formal events, and even competitive cooking shows can trace some of their ceremonial roots back to these medieval practices. Cooking techniques were practical and evolving. Roasting, boiling, baking, and stewing were common. Pies and pastries helped preserve food. Smoking, salting, and pickling extended shelf life. These methods informed modern culinary practices, from preserved meats to baked goods. Finally, communal meals strengthened social cohesion. Villagers, guild members, or noble households shared food, stories, and laughter. Feasts and daily meals alike reinforced bonds, passed down traditions, and celebrated collective identity. Today, we see echoes in family dinners, potlucks, and community festivals, where food continues to connect people. So, when you savor a hearty meal, enjoy a spice-laden dish, or attend a holiday feast, remember, Many of the flavors, rituals, and culinary traditions we enjoy today trace back to the Middle Ages. Food was never just nourishment. It was identity, celebration, and art. Next time you bite into bread, sip wine, or enjoy a roasted feast, imagine the flickering torchlight of a medieval hall, the laughter of villagers or nobles, and the rich aroma of herbs and spices filling the air. The past lives on, not only in the recipes we follow, but in the very way we gather, celebrate, and share meals today. Chapter 13: Festivals, Holidays, and Seasonal Traditions. Picture a medieval village as winter begins to lift and spring awakens. The streets are alive with villagers carrying baskets, musicians playing pipes and drums, and the smell of fresh baked goods drifting through the air. Festivals and holidays were some of the most important markers of life in the Middle Ages. They weren't just about celebration. They reinforced community, religion, and the rhythms of the seasons. Many traditions we follow today can be traced back to these medieval practices. The medieval calendar was filled with feast days, saints' days, and seasonal celebrations. Christmas and Easter were major religious festivals, celebrated with church services, feasting, and music. But beyond these, almost every week had a local or regional celebration, often tied to a saint, a harvest, or a market day. These events brought the entire community together and created a shared sense of identity and rhythm. Seasonal festivals often centered on agriculture. Harvest festivals were particularly important, marking the end of the growing season and giving thanks for the crops. Villagers brought their best produce to the church or the Lord's manor, where it might be blessed, displayed, or used in communal feasts. Dancing, singing, and games were common. These celebrations were not just fun. They were a way to honor nature, acknowledge labor, and prepare for the leaner months ahead. Modern harvest festivals and Thanksgiving traditions echo these ancient rhythms. Carnivals and pre-Lenten celebrations were another key part of medieval life. Before the fast of Lent, communities held feasts, parades, and sometimes playful mischief. Masks, costumes, and mock battles were common, allowing people to let off steam before the restrictions of fasting began. This idea of celebration before a period of solemnity survives today in Carnival in Europe, Mardi Gras in the Americas, and other pre-fasting traditions. Religious holidays also had a social component. Pilgrimages, church fairs, and Saints' Day processions provided opportunities for gathering, commerce, and entertainment. Traveling minstrels, jugglers, and performers often entertained crowds, blending faith with festivity. In this way, medieval festivals combined devotion with joy, much like modern religious and cultural celebrations that mix ritual with fun. Feasting was central to festivals. Long tables in village halls or manor houses groaned under the weight of meats, pies, breads, fruits, and sweets. Spices and decorations elevated the presentation, especially among the wealthy. People ate communally, often with music, storytelling, and games. Modern holiday dinners, community feasts, and banquet-style celebrations continue this tradition of shared food and fellowship. Some traditions arose from local customs or pagan roots, later incorporated into Christian holidays. For example, decorating trees, lighting fires, or dancing around a maypole celebrated seasonal cycles and natural renewal. Over time, these customs merged with Christian observances, creating the layered, rich traditions we see today in holidays like Christmas and May Day. Music and dance were integral to festival life. Minstrels, pipers, drummers, and singers provided entertainment. Dancing was not only fun but also a communal activity that reinforced social bonds. Seasonal dances, wedding dances, and festival processions were all occasions to move together as a community. Modern folk festivals, parades, and even concert traditions can trace some of their communal spirit back to these medieval dances. Games and competitions were common. Archery contests, jousting, horse races, and even board games or simple village competitions allowed people to display skill, strength, and cleverness. Winners were often rewarded with prizes, public recognition, or even symbolic honors. Today's sporting events, competitions, and festivals with contests reflect this medieval love for play combined with social display. Gift-giving and charity were also part of festivals. During Christmas or Saints' Days, the wealthy might give gifts or food to the poor. This practice emphasized social responsibility and community cohesion. Modern holiday gift-giving and charitable acts carry echoes of this medieval generosity and moral instruction. Fairs were another highlight. Often timed to coincide with religious festivals, fairs brought merchants, performers, and craftspeople to towns. People bought goods, watched performances, and exchanged news. These fairs were precursors to modern markets, trade shows, and community festivals that combine commerce and celebration. Lighting played a symbolic and practical role. Candles, torches, and bonfires illuminated feasts, processions, and evening celebrations. They represented guidance, hope, and the presence of the divine. Today, we still light candles during religious observances, festivals, and celebrations, echoing this medieval symbolism. Children participated in festivals too. They played games, helped in preparations, and sometimes performed in pageants. Festivals offered education, entertainment, and a sense of belonging. Modern children's holiday traditions, school plays, and community events continue this engagement, connecting young participants with the rhythms of culture. Seasonal storytelling was common. Tales of saints, local heroes, myths, and moral lessons were told around fires or during feasts. These stories preserved history, morals, and entertainment in one. Today, storytelling during holidays, plays, and even bedtime stories echo this medieval custom. Finally, festivals reinforce cycles of life. Birth, marriage, death, planting, and harvest were all marked by celebrations. These shared rituals strengthened social cohesion, transmitted values, and connected people to both nature and faith. Modern cultural, religious, and national holidays continue to serve this function, keeping communities linked across generations. So, when you celebrate a holiday, attend a festival, or gather for a feast, remember, many of the practices, rhythms, and joys of these events began in the Middle Ages. Dancing, music, food, games, and communal celebration created memories and bonds that have lasted centuries. Next time you see a festival or holiday tradition, imagine villagers centuries ago, laughing, singing, and feasting together. Their joy, creativity, and devotion helped shape the calendar of life we continue to follow today. Chapter 14: Fashion, Clothing, and Social Status. Imagine walking through a medieval market. People bustle past, dressed in vibrant fabrics, fur trims, and practical tunics. Some carry tools or baskets, while nobles glide by in luxurious gowns and fur-lined cloaks. Clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about warmth, it was a statement of identity, wealth, and social hierarchy. Surprisingly, many of the fashion rules, symbols, and trends from that time influenced clothing and style for centuries afterward. The most obvious marker of status was fabric. Wool was common for everyday wear, easily woven and durable. Linen was also used, especially for undergarments. Silk, velvet, and fine brocades were rare and expensive, often imported from distant lands. Only the wealthy could afford these luxurious materials. Today, we still associate certain fabrics with luxury, like silk, cashmere, or fine leather, echoing medieval distinctions. Colors conveyed meaning. Bright dyes were costly and often restricted by sumptuary laws, which dictated what people of different classes could wear. Red, purple, and blue were particularly expensive and signified wealth, power, or rank. Poorer villagers wore muted browns, grays, and greens, made from natural, easily available dyes. Modern fashion continues to use color as a signal, whether for branding, style, or social cues. Clothing shapes and silhouettes were also important. Tunics, gowns, surcoats, and mantles varied in length, cut, and decoration. Nobles wore long flowing robes, fitted sleeves, and elaborate headwear, while peasants preferred practical, shorter garments suitable for labor. The principle of function versus display remains in modern clothing. Sportswear for activity, formal wear for appearance. Accessories and adornments were key symbols. Belts, jewelry, and brooches indicated wealth and occupation. A merchant might wear a silver belt buckle, a knight a sword and crest, and a noblewoman pearls or jeweled pins. Hats, hoods, and veils also carried meaning. Today, accessories still communicate personal style, profession, or social identity. Footwear reflected both function and status. Peasants often wore simple leather shoes, while nobles could afford pointed shoes, boots, and decorative heels. Stockings and hose were common among the wealthy, sometimes in bright colors or patterns. The medieval obsession with shoes and detail is echoed in modern fashion trends and luxury footwear markets. Sumptuary laws regulated clothing strictly. Kings and local authorities determined who could wear certain fabrics, colors, or styles. Breaking these laws could result in fines or confiscation. These regulations reinforced social order and class distinction. Modern dress codes, uniforms, and ceremonial robes are descendants of this medieval attempt to visually encode social hierarchy. Headwear was particularly symbolic. Men and women wore hats, veils, wimples, or hoods, often signaling marital status, age, or social rank. Crowns, coronets, or jeweled headpieces were reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. The idea of using headwear to convey identity survives today in ceremonial hats, graduation caps, or traditional cultural attire. Layering was practical and stylish. People wore multiple layers for warmth and status display. Under tunics, chemises, or shirts provided a base, while surcoats, cloaks, and mantles added color, texture, and weight. Fur was added for luxury and insulation. Modern fashion still uses layering both for function and style, from coats and scarves to formal suits with vests. Clothing construction reflected skill and craft. Tailors, seamstresses, and embroiderers were valued artisans. Embroidery, applique, and intricate stitching showcased talent and taste. Guilds often regulated these trades, ensuring quality. Today, haute couture, bespoke tailoring, and artisan fashion continue this tradition of craft and skill in clothing. Practicality mattered too. Laborers, farmers, and tradespeople wore sturdy garments suitable for work. Reinforced seams, durable fabrics, and simple cuts allowed freedom of movement. Over time, these practical designs influenced everyday clothing, from work boots to jeans, showing continuity from medieval labor to modern wear. Season and climate influenced dress. Winter required heavy wool, fur linings, and cloaks, while summer allowed lighter fabrics and shorter tunics. People adapted to local conditions, creating regional styles. Modern clothing still follows this principle, balancing comfort, practicality, and fashion with seasonal adjustments. Children's clothing often mirrored adult styles, but simpler. Boys and girls wore tunics or gowns appropriate to their status, sometimes miniature versions of noble attire. Education, play, and chores dictated what was suitable, and the tradition of age-appropriate clothing continues today. Fashion could also reflect occupation. Monks, nuns, and clergy wore habits, while guild members often displayed symbols of their trade on their garments. Military uniforms, heraldic colors, and badges communicated role and affiliation. Modern uniforms, workwear, and professional attire are direct descendants of this functional symbolism. Textiles themselves told stories. Patterns, embroidery, and motifs reflected cultural influences, regional identity, or religious symbolism. Some designs were imported via trade, creating a fusion of styles. Today, fashion designers often blend cultural motifs and patterns, continuing the medieval practice of storytelling through textiles. Travel and trade influenced trends. Nobles traveling to other courts or merchants visiting foreign lands brought back new fabrics, dyes, and ideas. This cross-cultural exchange shaped fashion evolution, much like global fashion trends today. In essence, medieval clothing was a language. Color, material, cut, and accessories communicated wealth, status, occupation, and even moral virtue. Today's fashion, with its codes, trends, and social signals, still relies on this idea. What we wear tells others who we are. So, the next time you put on a suit, gown, or even a simple outfit, imagine the medieval tailor measuring fabric, dyeing silk, and stitching garments by hand. Every choice, color, cut, accessory was meaningful just as it is in modern life. The past lives on, not only in museums and paintings, but in the clothes we wear every day, quietly shaping how we express ourselves and understand social identity. Chapter 15: Entertainment, Music, and Games. Imagine stepping into a medieval village square. The air is alive with laughter, the strum of a lute, and the clatter of dice. Children run around playing tag, while adults watch jugglers, musicians, or storytellers. Entertainment in the Middle Ages was a mix of fun, education, and social connection. Surprisingly, many forms of play, music, and games that we enjoy today have roots in medieval life. Music was central to both everyday life and celebration. Minstrels and troubadours traveled from town to town, performing songs that told stories of love, heroism, and history. Instruments like lutes, harps, flutes, and drums were common. Music accompanied dances, feasts, and religious ceremonies. Today's folk music, concerts, and even storytelling through song echo these medieval traditions. Dance was the social glue. Villagers, nobles, and royalty alike danced at festivals, weddings, and court events. Some dances were simple, communal circle dances, while others were more elaborate, performed in courtly settings. Dancing taught rhythm, cooperation, and etiquette. Modern social dancing, from folk dances to ballroom, reflects the continuation of these medieval practices. Games provided both entertainment and skill development. Board games like chess, backgammon, and Nine Men's Morris were popular. Chess, especially, was seen as a game of strategy, teaching foresight and tactical thinking. Modern strategy games, competitive board games, and even video games carry forward this focus on planning, skill, and mental challenge. Children played simple games with sticks, balls, and hoops. Tag, hide-and-seek, and racing were common. Play taught physical coordination, social interaction, and creativity. Just like today, children's games were essential for development, fun, and learning social norms. Storytelling was both entertainment and education. Tales of saints, local heroes, myths, and legends were recited in halls, markets, and homes. Storytellers often added humor, suspense, or moral lessons. Modern books, films, podcasts, and even bedtime stories continue this tradition of using narrative to educate and entertain. Festivals offered spectacular performances. Jesters, acrobats, and traveling performers delighted crowds with tricks, comedy, and feats of skill. These shows were interactive, sometimes inviting audience participation. Today's street performers, circus acts, and comedy shows follow the same tradition, engaging spectators while entertaining and impressing. Hunting and sports were both pastime and display of skill. Archery contests, jousting tournaments, and horseback games allowed nobles to practice martial skills while entertaining spectators. Villagers might compete in races, wrestling, or tug-of-war. Modern sports, tournaments, and competitive games trace their roots back to these medieval forms of organized play. Music was also used in work and ritual. Singing while harvesting, chanting in religious ceremonies, or playing instruments during meals added rhythm and cohesion to daily life. Work songs, hymns, and ceremonial music helped coordinate activity, mark time, and create emotional resonance. Today, work songs, national anthems, and ceremonial music continue this tradition of rhythm and sound-shaping communal experience. Games of chance were popular too. Dice games, card games, introduced later, and simple gambling were common among adults. These games tested luck, strategy, and social bonds. Modern gaming, lotteries, and casual competitions can trace cultural roots to these medieval pastimes. Performance spaces were versatile. Village squares, castle halls, and temporary stages hosted entertainment. Actors, musicians, and storytellers adapted to the environment, sometimes using props or simple sets. Today's theater, open-air concerts, and performance art continue this flexibility and adaptability. Humor was integral. Jokes, playful pranks, and exaggerated tales brought joy, relieved tension, and created shared experiences. Humor helped communities cope with hardship, illness, or social tension. Modern comedy, satire, and playful media owe much to this medieval emphasis on laughter as social glue. Festivals, in particular, combined multiple forms of entertainment. Music, dance, games, and food all came together in immersive, communal experiences. People of different ages and social ranks participated, creating a sense of unity and celebration. Today's festivals, fairs, and public celebrations echo this medieval approach, blending culture, entertainment, and social bonding. Entertainment also reinforced cultural values. Stories of knights, saints, or moral lessons taught courage, honesty, and social norms. Games and competitions emphasized skill, fairness, and community engagement. Music and dance reinforced rhythm, coordination, and joy. In essence, medieval entertainment educated as much as it amused. A dual purpose we still see today in children's media, educational games, and cultural performances. Professional guilds sometimes sponsored performances or competitions, much like they regulated trade. Minstrels or performers could belong to guild-like organizations, ensuring skill, fair conduct, and quality. Modern professional associations, unions, or certification boards in the arts continue this principle of organizing and regulating talent. Theater began to take shape in the Middle Ages as well. Mystery plays, morality plays, and folk dramas depicted biblical stories or moral lessons. Actors used masks, costumes, and props to bring characters to life. Modern drama, stagecraft, and storytelling techniques build directly on these foundations. Finally, entertainment was a reflection of society. Nobles, merchants, and peasants all participated in different ways, but all forms reinforced hierarchy, skill, and community. Celebrations, games, and music connected people, transmitting culture, memory, and shared identity across generations. So, the next time you listen to music, play a game, or watch a performance, remember the medieval villagers, minstrels, and performers who created joy from daily life, ritual, and imagination. Their laughter, skill, and stories quietly echo in the ways we entertain, celebrate, and connect with one another today. Chapter 16: Legacy of the Middle Ages, Traditions that Survive Today. Imagine walking through a modern city or small town. You see festivals, markets, universities, professional guilds, and historic buildings. Perhaps you celebrate holidays with family, wear special clothes, or attend a graduation ceremony. Many of these familiar aspects of life trace back to the Middle Ages. Even though centuries have passed, the traditions, structures, and cultural practices of medieval Europe quietly shape the world we live in today. Let's start with education. Universities, diplomas, degrees, and even graduation robes originated in the medieval system. The trivium and quadrivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, formed the foundation of learning. Mentorship, lectures, debates, and exams created a model for higher education. Today's campuses, lecture halls, and even online courses echo the medieval commitment to structured learning, critical thinking, and intellectual community. Professional guilds and apprenticeships are another lasting legacy. The system of learning by doing under guidance from a master still exists in trades, internships, and vocational programs. Licensing, professional associations, and quality regulations all trace back to the way medieval guilds structured work, ethics, and social responsibility. When a modern chef, carpenter, or physician trains under supervision before becoming certified, they are following a tradition centuries old. Religious and cultural holidays also preserve medieval roots. Christmas, Easter, and All Saints' Day were major medieval celebrations, often layered with local or pagan customs. Decorating trees, lighting candles, and sharing meals with family reflect centuries-old rituals. Even folk festivals, harvest celebrations, and carnival-like events can be traced to medieval seasonal and religious observances. These traditions link us to a rhythm of life that has endured despite historical change. Food culture owes much to the Middle Ages. Communal meals, feasts, and holiday spreads have medieval origins. Recipes, spices, and cooking techniques were passed down and adapted over time. Think of bread, pies, roasted meats, and even the modern love for herbs and preserved foods. They all have roots in medieval kitchens. Food was a symbol of community, status, and celebration then, and it still carries those meanings today. Architecture and urban design reflect medieval influence as well. Gothic cathedrals, stone bridges, town halls, and castle-like buildings still inspire modern construction. Public squares, markets, and guild halls were central in towns and cities, creating spaces for commerce, celebration, and governance. Even today, we see echoes of medieval planning in civic buildings, cultural landmarks, and historical preservation efforts. Art, music, and storytelling continue to bear medieval influence. Stained glass, illuminated manuscripts, heraldry, and sculpture set the stage for visual culture. Folk music, dances, board games, and plays trace back to medieval forms of entertainment. The idea that art, music, and narrative serve both educational and entertainment purposes remains relevant. Modern museums, theaters, and music festivals preserve this cultural lineage. Fashion is another area where medieval influence lingers. The symbolism of clothing, color, material, and accessories reflecting status, occupation, or social role originated in medieval Europe. Even today, uniforms, ceremonial robes, luxury fabrics, and dress codes reflect the same principles of communication through clothing. Medieval tailoring, embroidery, and layering inspired centuries of design, culminating in the diversity of modern fashion. Medicine and health practices also carry echoes from the Middle Ages. While knowledge has advanced, the medieval focus on observation, herbal remedies, hygiene, and community care laid foundations for modern medicine. Hospitals, apprenticeship in medical training, and the holistic approach to patient care reflect centuries-old traditions of combining practical knowledge with ethical responsibility. Entertainment and leisure owe a lot to medieval culture. Festivals, fairs, games, and performance art were social glue, bringing communities together. Today's sports, street performances, and communal celebrations continue that legacy, emphasizing play, skill, and shared joy. Even video games and storytelling media carry forward the tradition of strategy, narrative, and community engagement. In essence, the Middle Ages were not just a distant past. They were a period of experimentation, codification, and tradition building. From education to holidays, food, fashion, medicine, art, and entertainment, medieval practices established frameworks we continue to follow. They were practical, symbolic, and communal, shaping behaviors, institutions, and cultural norms for generations. When you think of modern life, it's easy to assume it is entirely new, but look closely. Guild-like professional associations, seasonal celebrations, educational systems, and public performances all echo medieval traditions. Even the seemingly small things, breaking bread with family, celebrating a saint's day, wearing formal attire, or attending a concert, have medieval antecedents. The enduring legacy of the Middle Ages shows that culture, knowledge, and community practices are cumulative. Each generation builds on the previous one, adapting, refining, and preserving valuable traditions. This continuity reminds us that history is not only about the past. It shapes our everyday experiences, often in ways we barely notice. So, the next time you walk through a university campus, enjoy a festive meal, attend a ceremony, or play a game, remember that you are participating in centuries of tradition. Medieval Europeans, with their guilds, schools, festivals, and celebrations, laid the groundwork for much of what we consider ordinary today. The past lives on, quietly guiding how we learn, celebrate, create, and connect. In the end, the Middle Ages were a bridge. They connected the ancient world to the modern one, and many practices we take for granted began there. By understanding these roots, we not only appreciate history more deeply, but also see how human creativity, community, and culture evolve over time. The traditions of the Middle Ages continue to whisper in our lives, waiting for us to notice and celebrate them.